What's good in the hood, YouTube? This is Crazy Samurai 71 here, bringing you another video. Today I'm bringing a video on Kamen Rider Build episode 20. This episode is really good. It introduces a new form at the very end. We don't actually get to see it like in combat this episode, but it's pretty cool, and it will be used in the next episode. But it's pretty much a pretty significant part of the episode. And what I also wanted to mention is that this episode kind of foreshadows a big point that will happen next month. We'll get into that towards the end. The reason why I say this is because I've actually seen some of the scans for the next month's footage and like what things are coming. So there's sort of, I kind of already have an idea of like things to expect in the future. So we'll get into that later. But let's get started with the actual episode itself. The episode starts off with us continuing like we do in most episodes, where in the previous episode we ended up seeing that Suichi approached Sento as Bloodstark, offering him the hazard trigger. Basically what we find out from Suichi is that this hazard trigger is a device that can make a person lose his sense of self, meaning that, you know, he can do things without even realizing that he's doing them. And there's more to it, but as we know in the previous episode, the Hokuto trio were affected by the hazard trigger because Suichi gave it to them. And the thing is that since they're hard smashes, since they're smashes in general, they don't have control. Like if they use it and if they're not careful with it, they could die, as opposed to Sento, Ryoga, or Grease, where like if they use it they won't die because they're not smashes. They're riders. So it's a little different, but obviously it can push you to an extreme limit where you're losing your sense of self. So again, there are still effects that do come into play here. So what does end up happening is Suichi also mentions the fact that he's looking to push them to he's trying to make Sento and Ryoga push each other to make each other stronger and stronger. But at the same time, Sento asks why that is. He doesn't answer. He says at some other time I will tell you that. So clearly there's going to be more to that in the future. It's just a matter of what and when will we learn that. But we'll know soon, I'm sure. It's just, I don't know when. So what does end up happening from here is that Sento ends up returning back to the cafe location of their base or whatever, and he ends up talking with Sawa, Mizora, and Ryoga. They end up having a casual conversation. One of the things that's brought up is the fact that Mizora now has this healing ability that she has from her bracelet that she ended up using on Ryoga in the previous episode. So clearly that is something to note and means a bunch, because that's no small ability, because she can really use it. And like, you would think it's just one time, but in reality she does it later on, and it's pretty interesting. So we'll get into that part very soon. But what does end up happening from here is, they continue to discuss different things. Eventually Sento goes down to the lower level of the base to look in on the information on the hazard trigger from the database that he has on Katsuragi. So he ends up inputting hazard trigger into the database, and he ends up learning about what the hazard trigger does and how it affects the body and all that, and how you could potentially die. And he gets a little freaked out or whatever. But then following all this, Gintaku contacts Sento, basically telling him that the archaeological museum is under attack by by the Hokuto trio and Grease. So what happens is that Sento goes with Ryoga down to the archaeology museum to go investigate. So then we end up seeing the trio and Grease together. And one of the things that happens from here is, that happens later. But what ends up happening from here is that they're in the museum, and I believe there's something that happens in between where we end up seeing that Grease gets into a fight with the Hokuto trio, because the thing is that he doesn't remember their names because their names, the names that we know them by, aren't their actual names. They had prior names when they were working as his farm assistants. But the thing is that Grease lost his memory. So when he lost his memory, he doesn't remember what their names actually are. And the thing is that like they know that their names aren't the names that they have, and like they always feel bad now because like they wish that he would remember their names so that he would talk to them the right way. And you know, they don't feel like as close to him as they were, and at the same time they still really care about him. And the thing is that because they gave Shuichi the right to expose him to the hazard trigger, he doesn't really want them to work with him all that much because he feels like, why would you allow him to do something so dangerous to you? Because you could die. So, you know, there's a lot of anger and upset, but eventually when they steal from the archaeological museum or whatever, basically what happens is that, and I'm just saying that other part happens in the cafe that they go to, the barber shop or whatever. And what does end up happening from here is that we find out that there's only 14 more bottles that they need to find, and that the Pandora's box itself. And what also we learn is the fact that Grease is going to let them continue to work for him as long as they stay alive, which is logical, but is a bit of an extreme because it's like, well, yeah, of course they have to stay alive, but it is an interesting scenario. And they cheer and they carry out Grease, and then from there what happens is that we end up seeing Ryoga and Sento confront them after they drop Grease on the ground. So then at that point what happens is that Sento fights with the 3 Hokuto trio members while Ryoga fights against Grease because, you know, the two of them are Splash Driver uses, while Sento ends up using Nin Comics, which is cool because we haven't seen Nin Comics in quite some time actually. And that fight lasts a decent while until eventually Sento is actually thinking of using the hazard trigger in this form, which he doesn't use. He actually gets distracted and gets concerned with the fact that he could potentially lose himself. He doesn't want to risk that, so he avoids it and eventually gets beaten up a bunch. Then from there, Ryoga continues to want to get stronger and stronger and push himself to his limits. And, you know, there's constant similarities between the two of them in the senses that they're both fighters and they're both natural born ones, and they just want to push each other. So all that's happening. What does end up happening from here is that eventually Ryoga pushes himself too much and the Splash Driver stops him, and then he basically faints and blacks out and de-transforms. At that point, Sento swoops in using Rocket Panda to actually get them away, and they return back to the base where Mizora uses her bracelet to heal Ryoga back up to health so that he wakes up and he's good, and Mizora falls asleep this time because from overuse of her bracelet again. So then at that point, clearly, you know, Ryoga's a little annoyed that he had to do all that, and eventually they are contacted to go into Gentaku's location for the Totoro Institute. There, what ends up happening is that they are spoken to by him about some new information that he has, which is the fact that he's planning on doing an assault on Hokuto, because if they go directly to there, they can potentially stop the war directly and end it, because just staying on the defense doesn't mean that you're going to make much progress in the end. They can just continue to attack and nothing will really happen that will benefit them. So what Gentaku's thinking of is do a full frontal attack so that way you can attack them from their center and take them out. And so Sento doesn't want to do that. Ryoga thinks it's a smart idea, but at the same time he respects Sento a lot. He's not just going to be someone that's going to jump out, but at the same time eventually they end up getting into a conversation where they fight with each other a little bit, and then eventually Gentaku calls Ryoga to come with him and talk to him. At that point, what ends up happening is that Sento returns back to the base, where we end up hearing Sawa and Mizora discussing certain matters regarding her abilities with her bracelets. And one of the things that she mentions, which is interesting, is that she's considering using her bracelet to heal up the Prime Minister, who's still incapacitated. It was unclear whether or not he was dead or alive. Apparently, he is alive. He's just in a coma state. So that is something to note. So they actually plan on going to the Prime Minister and reviving him. So what does end up happening from here is that Sento's very annoyed at Ryoga for like siding with Gentaku and everything and doing all this stuff. And one of the things that Sento feels is that he's just this muscle brain that's just trying to get stronger and stronger, and just he's all about his strength and everything. When in reality, Sento's trying to end this war because he's doing it for Sento's sake. Not Sento. Ryoga's trying to end this war because he's trying to do it for Sento's sake. And the thing is that Mizora mentions this to Sento, and then he realizes how much he really does care. And from here, what ends up happening is that Sento returns back to the Toso Institute to speak to Gentaku. There, he asks, where is Ryoga? And what happens is that Gentaku shows on monitor what's going on, which is that Gentaku sent a large troop of Toto's government into Hokuto with Ryoga so that they can go in and attack Hokuto directly. In the meantime, we also end up seeing that Sawa and Mizora sneak into the hospital, dress up as nurses, and try to heal up the Prime Minister, which eventually they're continuing to attack Hokuto when suddenly the Prime Minister appears with Sawa, Mizora, and several Totoro guards. And what happens is that the Prime Minister wants to stop this attack on Hokuto directly, and basically the Prime Minister kicks Gentaku out, and he says, I don't have a son anymore. He says, get out of Totoro. So at that point, what ends up happening is that Gentaku transforms into Night Rogue. His father freaks out because he had no idea that was the case. And what ends up happening from here is Gentaku ends up stealing the Pandora's box and flies away. In the meantime, Sento transforms into his Hawk Gatling form and chases after him. They get into a fight, and eventually they land on the ground, where Sento ends up using Rabbit Tank Sparkling to fight against him. At that point, what ends up happening is that they fight, and Sento actually beats him pretty easily, which tells you something right away, because if Sento's hazard level is weaker than Ryoga's, then if Sento was able to defeat him, then Ryoga would be able to pretty much destroy him in a way, which is pretty crazy to think, because the fight was fairly one-sided, and that was totally not the case initially. But again, Gentaku has been out of the fight for quite some time, so that is something to note. But one thing that's important to note is that Gentaku eventually says that I will be back, and I'll be back stronger with more powerful friends, and this isn't over. So he ends up retreating at that point. And the reason why that's important is because that is exactly what's going to happen eventually. He is going to, next month, come back as Kamen Rider Rogue and fight with some new friends, which are from a different... which are from Saito, from Saito. So just keep that in mind, that is going to happen. But we'll get into that next month when the actual episodes start airing. But they just revealed it in some catalog images that yes, that's what's happening. That eventually he will return back as Kamen Rider Rogue, and he will be up against them. So that's going to be interesting to see, of course. We don't know all the details of that, so don't hold me to everything from that, but I'm just saying I've seen some information about it, and it sounds like that is the case. So what does end up happening from here is Sento ends up going to where Ryoga is, because the thing is that suddenly the Hokuto trio attacks, and so does Grease, and what happens is that Sento ends up watching as Ryoga fights using this glass driver and everything, and Sento initially is in his Hawk Gatling form, but the thing is that eventually Sento realizes when he's detransformed that like Ryoga really does care about him. He's doing this fight for Sento's sake, and he's ready to cry a little bit just because of how much like they really care for each other. Like they're really friends in a way. It's just that they have a hard time showing it because they like to butt heads a lot. And what happens is that eventually Sento says that I'm going to save Ryoga, and he ends up pulling out the hazard trigger, and he puts the hazard on and then inserts it into the driver. And then we see for a split second his new rabbit tank hazard form, because he puts the trigger in. He puts in the rabbit tank bottles with the hazard trigger and everything, and then for a split second he uses the rabbit tank hazard form, which is really cool. It's pretty much all black, but it has some. It looks like rabbit tank, but with like a very dark finish to it, which is really cool. I can't wait to see it next episode, and it should be a pretty interesting thing to see. There are 2 hazard forms that we are expecting to see this between now and the end of next month, most likely, which are this form, the rabbit tank hazard form, and the smartphone wolf form. Those are the 2 forms that will get hazard mode that we know of so far. Doesn't mean that there aren't any others, but those are the 2 that we know of. There will likely be others. We just don't know of them yet. So let me know your guys' opinions. Are you guys looking forward to seeing the next episode of Kamen Rider Build? I personally thought this episode was really good. I'm looking forward to seeing what will happen now since Gintaku has left. The Totoro government's leader now is back to being the prime minister, so that is interesting. Of course, I don't know what that means as far as dealing with the fight that's occurring in Totoro, because of the fact that the prime minister has been out for a while, and I don't know what his goals are and whether or not he will contact Sento and Ryoga. We don't really know how that's going to work now. It's still a large mystery in a lot of ways what's going to happen from here. He might not be part of the war that much at all, and like nothing will happen there, but it's very hard to say so far as to what will actually come of this because of the Totoro Totoro prime minister. So we'll have to wait and see. I'd love to know your opinions. What do you think will happen with him? Do you think that he'll actually become someone that will want to take charge? Do you think that everyone will ignore the prime minister? How do you think that will work with him? Because clearly his position is important, but at the same time he's been out of it for a while. He doesn't know everything that's going on, and with Hokuto attacking, what will his methods of attack be? So I'd love to know your opinions. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you guys think. I'll see you guys in the next video. So until then, guys, I'm Crazy Samurai 71, and goodbye, guys.